Around 4,000 years ago, in a mud-brick temple beside the Euphrates River, a group of women gathered on a rooftop and began to weep. They tore their clothes. They smeared ash on their faces. They cried out the name of a god who was dead. 2,000 miles away, on the banks of the Nile, another group of mourners was performing an almost identical ritual. They were planting seeds inside a wooden frame shaped like a human body, watering it every day, waiting for green shoots to rise out of what looked like a corpse. On the other side of the world, in the highlands of what is now Guatemala, Maya priests were telling a story about a father who was killed, buried inside the earth, and reborn as the very crop that fed their entire civilization. These people never met. They never traded goods. They spoke languages that had no common root. Separated by oceans, deserts, and thousands of years, they had no possible way of copying each other's ideas. And yet, again and again, in civilization after civilization, humans invented the exact same impossible story. A god dies and then comes back to life. Egypt had one. Mesopotamia had one. Greece had one. Scandinavia had one. Even the Aztecs and the Maya, isolated from the rest of the world by two oceans, had one. For over a century, scholars have argued about why. Some have called it coincidence. Others have called it the oldest religious pattern on earth. But if you strip away the gods, the temples, and the sacred names, and look only at what these myths were actually describing, a strange thing happens. You start to notice that these stories weren't really about gods at all. They were about the sun disappearing, about the crops dying in the fields, about the terrifying, mysterious, world-ending darkness of winter, and about the desperate hope that light and life and food would somehow return. This is the story of how the fear of a changing season became the foundation of religion itself. The problem with living on a tilted planet. To understand why these myths exist, you first have to understand something that ancient people did not know, and that changed everything about how humans experience time. The Earth is tilted. Not much, about 23.5 degrees on its axis. But that small tilt is the reason winter exists at all. As the Earth orbits the Sun, this tilt means that for half the year, the northern half of the planet leans away from the Sun, and for the other half, it leans toward it. That is the entire mechanical reason the days get shorter, the temperatures drop, the plants die, and the animals disappear. Today, a child in elementary school can explain this in 30 seconds. But for the vast majority of human history, nobody knew this. Nobody could see the tilt. Nobody could measure the orbit. All that early humans could observe was this. Every single year, without warning, without mercy, the world began to die. The sun rose a little lower in the sky. The days grew shorter. The warmth disappeared. The plants that had fed entire villages withered and turned brown. The animals that had provided meat migrated away or vanished into hibernation. And then, for weeks or months, depending on where you lived, everything simply stopped. If you were a hunter-gatherer, this was frightening but survivable. You could follow game. You could move. But somewhere around 10,000 BCE, in a handful of regions across the globe, the Fertile Crescent, the Nile Valley, parts of China, and later Mesoamerica, something happened that would permanently change the relationship between humans and the seasons. Humans invented farming. And farming did not just change what people ate. It changed what people feared. When food stopped moving and started growing. A hunter-gatherer who watches an animal disappear can chase another one. But a farmer who watches a field die has nowhere else to go. Farming tied entire communities to a single, immovable patch of ground, and that ground was completely at the mercy of a cycle nobody understood and nobody controlled. Once agriculture became the foundation of civilization, the changing of the seasons stopped being an inconvenience. It became the single most terrifying event of the year. If the crops failed to return in spring, there was no backup plan. There was no neighboring herd to hunt. There was only starvation. This is the psychological seedbed, quite literally, that dying and rising gods grew out of. Ancient people needed an explanation for why the world seemed to die every year. And more importantly, they needed a reason to believe it would come back. So they told a story. And the story had to have two things: a death and a resurrection. Egypt, the god who was torn apart and sewn back together. The oldest and most detailed version of this myth comes from Egypt, and it centers on a god named Osiris. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was once a living king who ruled over Egypt during a golden age, teaching humans agriculture, law, and civilization itself. But his brother, Set, a god associated with chaos, deserts, and storms, grew jealous of him. Set murdered Osiris, and depending on which version of the myth you read, either drowned him in the Nile or locked him inside a coffin and threw him into the river. That alone would be a tragic story. But Egyptian mythology takes it much further. In the most famous version, Set doesn't just kill Osiris. He dismembers his body into pieces and scatters them across Egypt, trying to make sure his brother could never be put back together. Osiris's wife, the goddess Isis, refused to accept this. She traveled across Egypt collecting every single piece of her husband's body. When she finally reassembled him, she used her magic to bring him back to life just long enough to conceive a child, the god Horus, who would grow up to avenge his father and defeat Set. Osiris himself did not return to rule the living. Instead, he became the god of the afterlife and the underworld, judging the souls of the dead and granting them eternal life, just as he himself had experienced. Here's where the story stops being just mythology and starts being agriculture in disguise. Every single year, the Nile River flooded. This flood, called the inundation, deposited thick, black, fertile silt across the farmland of Egypt, and that silt was the reason Egyptian civilization could survive in the middle of a desert at all. Before the flood, the land was dry, cracked, and lifeless, dead just like Osiris's body. After the flood, the land became rich and green again, reborn just like Osiris. The Egyptians didn't just tell this story. They performed it. During a festival called the Koyak Festival, priests would create small figures known as Osiris beds, molds shaped like the god's mummified body filled with soil and planted with barley seeds. Over several days, the seeds would sprout and green shoots would literally grow out of the shape of Osiris's corpse. Imagine watching that as an ancient Egyptian farmer. You are staring at a symbolic dead body, and life is physically growing out of it in front of your eyes. That is not a religious metaphor to a farmer whose entire survival depends on the harvest. That is a promise made visible. Mesopotamia, the god who went underground. While Osiris was dying and returning along the Nile, a strikingly similar story was unfolding in Mesopotamia, in the world's first cities, built between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Sumerians told the story of Tammuz, a shepherd god who was married to Inanna, the powerful goddess of love, fertility, and war. Later, in Babylon, this same god was worshipped under the name Tammuz, and his consort became known as Ishtar. In the myth known as the Descent of Inanna, the goddess travels down into the underworld to visit her sister, the queen of the dead. But the underworld has strict laws. Nothing that enters can leave without giving something in return. Inanna is stripped, judged, and struck dead, her lifeless body hung on a hook like meat in a butcher's shop. Eventually, through the intervention of other gods, Inanna is revived. But the underworld demands a replacement. Someone must take her place among the dead. She returns to the world above and finds her husband, Tammuz, sitting comfortably on his throne, seemingly unbothered by her absence. In her fury, or in some versions, through no fault of her own but simply because the underworld's laws must be satisfied, Tammuz is dragged down to the underworld in her place. Every year, according to Sumerian and Babylonian belief, Tammuz/Tammuz would die and descend into the underworld, and the world above would mourn him. Women would gather, weep, and sing funeral laments. This wasn't just poetic ritual, it left a mark on history so significant that it appears outside of Mesopotamian sources entirely. In the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Ezekiel describes seeing women in Jerusalem, weeping for Tammuz, disturbed enough by this foreign ritual to record it as a warning against following gods other than his own. And just like Osiris, Tammuz did not stay dead. According to the surviving myths and the seasonal rituals built around them, he would eventually return from the underworld, and his return corresponded with the return of vegetation, fertility, and the flowing of rivers used for irrigation. Once again, underneath the divine drama, you can see the actual event being described. Crops die, fields turn barren, and everyone waits, terrified, for spring. Greece, the daughter who was stolen and the mother who stopped the world. If you've ever wondered why ancient Greek religion felt obsessed with cycles of death and rebirth, the answer lies in one of the most emotionally devastating myths in the entire Greek tradition, the story of Demeter and Persephone. Demeter was the goddess of the harvest, responsible for the fertility of all crops and grain on earth. Her daughter, Persephone, was abducted by Hades, god of the underworld, who dragged her down into his realm to become his wife. Demeter's grief was not a quiet sadness. According to the myth, she was so devastated by the loss of her daughter that she abandoned her divine duties entirely. Crops stopped growing. Fields turned barren. Famine spread across the entire world, and it kept spreading because a grieving goddess had simply stopped